Hi everyone, and welcome back to Rod TV after our little break. I must say I missed talking to you last week. I hope you missed listening to me as much. Well, we're back and with an all new and very exciting episode. Just first to say, a lot of you have been asking about if Penny has kept her job here in the Rod TV micro studio, and I'm pleased to say I found her setting up this morning as I started getting my act together. And once I was ready to start the recording, there she was occupying my space. So I reckon she thinks it's time for her to do some of these recordings herself. So we'll see. But in the last couple of weeks, a more serious and important question has been asked of me by a lot of people, and that is in response to the terrifying bombings that we've seen in Europe, the Middle East, the East, elsewhere in these last weeks of March. And it must be said that people are worrying about what does this mean for them and what does it mean for the future. And people say, could astrology have predicted that? Is there any value for astrology in perhaps being able to predict, anticipate where, and warn us ahead of time, prepare us for such usually unforeseen events? Well, of course, the problems that we face are that we are dealing with an entire planet, not just one particular place, because a bombing or an attack could happen anywhere. So when the astrologer has to look at what's happening in the near future or in the future, really we are generally confined by where we look. I could say what's happening in South Africa in the near future, as you've seen me do in the last few weeks, but that's because I know then to draw all my charts for South Africa. So what do we do when we face the whole world? Well, there are two things you need to know before we go there. You have heard me talk about the planets Uranus and Pluto as the major socio-political cycle planets at this time because of their current interrelationship. So you already know that during this period, I'm going to be watching those planets. In fact, in contemporary astrology, these are the planets that also represent trauma and violence, and Uranus would literally be used to represent explosions and bombings. Pluto was the one that represented the atomic bomb, for example, which was, of course, the first one stuffed with plutonium. So these are violent, destructive forces that they symbolize. But originally in astrology, before those planets were known, the planets Mars and Saturn were used to symbolize the same things, as well as all the bad stuff of the world. The harmful and difficult things come from Mars and Saturn. Mars especially being related to explosions, violence, and war, and Saturn, lots of bad consequences thereof, including things like the consequences of the past. So that's the one thing you need to know. We'll also need to consider those bad guys, Mars and Saturn, with our usual culprits this year, Uranus and Pluto. And the other thing that you need to know is astrologers love charts, of course, and we do a special chart 4 times a year. Each equinox and each solstice, the seasons change on Earth, and astrologically, those are the socio-political change points as well. Those are the crux change points on our yearly earthly cycle. Ask any plant, they know about them. And of course, whether we're aware of it or not, we also change our cycles according to the natural cycles of the sun and the earth. So astrologers draw these special charts called ingress charts, and that helps us see what's going on at any particular time. So let's look at the March equinox that we've had just a couple of weeks ago, 10 days ago or so, and that tells us a little bit about what we should expect during this quarter of the year. So here is the type of chart that we draw for any particular place to see what's happening in that particular place over the next 3 months or so. We draw these charts with every equinox and every solstice, And that really shows us the political and social season for what's happening on the planet, just like it actually produces the physical seasons. So here's an example of such a chart. I've removed all the unnecessaries. Only our particular, in this case, bad guys are on this chart. There are Uranus and Pluto, who you've come to know over the last few weeks with me, and there are the classical bad guys, Saturn and Mars. And astrologers always get concerned when Saturn and Mars are near each other like that, because they might capture someone or something between them. And if Mars and Saturn get very close to each other like that, as they will every few years, and they capture something between them, then that something is in trouble. It's like being surrounded by enemies, and that is called besiegement in astrology, just like it is in the world out there. So this is Cape Town, but of course, depending on where you are in the world, the sky looks very different. Everything is in a different place in the sky because you're looking at it from a different spot on the globe. So at that same moment, the moment of the ingress earlier in March, if I was looking at the sky from Brussels, it would look like this. Now, these red lines on the map are kind of like the 4 points of the compass. They basically are. The horizontal one is east and west, and the vertical one shows what is directly above and below that particular place. So they're not at a perfect square shape, not a perfect cross like you saw in Cape Town, because the length of the day varies from place to place, and that's how it would look on a chart. So here we are in Brussels at that very moment, and as you can see, Saturn and Mars have captured the overhead point, that red line between them. Now in astrology, what matters more than anything else are those 4 points. They are traditionally called pivot points, the points around which everything turns. And so when something happens on those points, or to those points, there are great big changes in that place. We even use the same thing for individuals. We look at their individual charts, they've also got those points, and when something happens on those points is how we make a prediction when something will change in someone's life. Of course, astrologers are using a richer array of techniques that I can show you here, but we're simplifying it for the purposes of this episode. Immediately, we have alarm bells going off because in Brussels, if one of the pivot points has been besieged, captured by Mars and Saturn, there's a much higher likelihood that during the ensuing 3 months, something can happen in the nature of either Mars and Saturn or something warlike, besiegement-like, like that. It turns out that if we looked at the chart of Lahore in Pakistan at that moment as well, we would see the same alarm bells. There you can see that Saturn and Mars have captured the western pivot point of the chart. Now I stress again that all over the world this is going to look different, and for the vast majority of places, just like Cape Town, Saturn and Mars won't have captured anything, especially not those 4 points, which will only occur in 4 bands around the world. So what we can do is actually project this onto the world. You know, if I was an astrologer in Brussels or I was an astrologer in Lahore, I would be concerned. Astrologers draw the charts for their local place every equinox and solstice and generally comment on their local place. And in those areas, astrologers would have been concerned that the pivot points were besieged. It's not the only areas in the world that there would be. And if we were looking at the whole world, how would we know? So what we do is we literally project that onto the world. And we draw lines for where planets are near those pivot points. So here is a map of the world with those same positions projected onto them. And you can see vertical straight lines, that shows when a planet is above or below, and the curved lines, which, because this is really a flattened sphere that we're looking at, so the curved lines show when planets are on the eastern or western pivot points. Again, I'm only concentrating on our particular culprits, but what you can see here is pretty striking. If you looked at this at the equinox, never mind what country you're in, you would be concerned about the areas between Mars and Saturn, because they are the areas where Mars and Saturn have captured the pivot points. You can look on the left-hand side of this map and see Central America and the extreme eastern edge of the United States, just off Washington, but not at the capital. And you can look at the right of this map where there's some dotted lines, same Mars and Saturn, and you can see the extreme eastern part of New Zealand as well. But what draws your attention is the middle of the map. And there you can see Mars and Saturn at that ingress captured Western Europe. There, that central part of Western Europe, and alerts us of a higher potential for something to happen during these 3 months in that place. We can't say exactly when just by looking at this chart, and in reality we are coming to this after the fact, once we already know the time that something happens. If we look at that same chart of the sky for the time that the first bomb went off in Brussels, you will see that Pluto itself was sitting right on that pivot point. Here it is on the world map, where you can see that purple Pluto line goes straight through Brussels. Now, I must stress that that line moves very quickly. The Earth is spinning. 10 minutes later, it will be nowhere near Brussels. It will be way off, probably over the UK by then. So because it moves that quickly, and means each one of these lines sweeps around the whole world every day, you could never anticipate when it's going to trigger something. But we can see, when we look after the fact, that the Pluto line was going straight through Brussels. Pluto was on the pivot point at the very moment the bombing happened. And in fact, if we look at Lahore, you can see here both Uranus and Pluto are sitting on those pivot points at the time of the explosion. Here it is represented on the map. Look over there and you can see the Uranus line going straight through Lahore. In fact, Uranus and Pluto's lines are both in Pakistan at that time, which is also, as we know, an alarming warning that the chaotic times that we live in, that you've seen represented by these two planetary cycles, are focused around that part of the world. Certainly, after the fact, it is very easy to see that there are clear warning signs. Late in my preparation for this particular episode, news came out of the bombing in Iraq, and of course I quickly looked at the Iraq chart at the moment of that ingress, at the moment of that equinox, and here we can see that Pluto was smack on the pivot point at the top of the chart for them. It wasn't a situation of being captured by Mars and Saturn, but now from what we've seen, the power of that Pluto in that position, which was there in the Brussels bombing earlier in the same month, would be a warning sign to us that that is not a safe place in the world. And in fact, when we look at Iraq at the time of the bombing itself, we can see Uranus and Pluto both very much on those pivot points, just like we saw in Lahore. So here it is on the world map, and there you can see the Uranus and Pluto lines now both go through Iraq. So as you can see, we do have these very powerful tools that allow us to understand what's going on in any particular area. And if astrologers in that area are drawing charts and paying attention to their charts as they should be, and drawing charts for the equinoxes and solstices in those areas as they are likely to be doing, then it's likely that they are seeing those warning signs as well. When the planets are directly overhead at the time of a bombing is harder to anticipate because they'll be directly overhead or on those pivot points every day, flying by just for a few minutes a day, but every day. So we need to know that if it is a season of besiegement by Uranus and Pluto, or Mars and Saturn, or something like you've seen here, then we know to be on alert. And if our culture worked that way, astrologers could use the rest of their tools to try and find out when that might be. Even going back, here's a brief glimpse of the Paris bombing, the planets at the moment of the Paris bombing, and you can see Mars was crossing over Paris, that dotted red line there, just at the time of that bombing. Mars, the traditional planet for explosive war, bombs, things like that. Uranus and Mars, mostly fulfilling that function. Where does that leave us for what follows this year? Is this information useful to us for the rest of the year? Well, it certainly is. This year, Mars and Saturn continue their little dance up and down, staying very close to each other, trying to capture whatever they can. And when we come to the next seasonal change, which is the solstice in June, we look at the chart again, and what do we see? Here we see Mars and Saturn again, strongly emphasizing Western Europe. Saturn's line going straight through Paris, and now the western part, which includes Spain, Portugal, of course France, and the United Kingdom, are highly sensitized areas in Europe, and I would be very concerned, especially for France, because we must use the knowledge of how history is playing out at this time, and would still astrologically worry about bombings or other warlike activities at this time. I'll draw your attention also to the fact that Pluto and Uranus have lines going through Iraq at this time. They will be hovering around Iraq and have just passed through them at that time. So that is a little bit of a warning sign still there. And of course, the eastern United States. So it's possible that we have some concerns there, but I think really those are referring to other concerns that Americans might already have. But certainly, if I was an astrologer consulting the United States government, which right now they don't have, but have had in the past, I would actually warn them that there is a greater danger in the third quarter of the year for the conflict to move their way. But my main concern remains Western Europe at that time. And if we take it further to the last quarter of the year, amazingly, Mars and Saturn continue their besiegement behavior, although it will finally start falling away during that last quarter of the year. And there you can see in that last quarter, Mars and Saturn have clearly captured the Middle East, also Iraq in that picture. There again you see Uranus and Pluto both have lines going through Pakistan. Tells us that the nature of the conflict this year is going to continue in the areas that we already know. By the late part of the year, conflict in the Middle East might include other areas as well. You can see Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula very much under Saturn, and Israel, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, those Middle Eastern countries including, of course, Syria, the source of a lot of the conflict at the moment, all caught up in that Mars-Saturn besiegement in the last quarter of the year. So we will see a lot more activity during that time. And then by the final months of the year, all of this will fade away. So, could we have predicted the horrific bombings in Brussels and Lahore and near Baghdad and various other places around the world? Well, to be truthful, not really, because as you can see, on its own, just using the Mars and Saturn besiegement and the Uranus and Pluto focal points gets us close to it, but not close enough, because there simply is too much space on the Earth, and uh, every single day, every place within that Mars Saturn besiegement is triggered by whatever Mars, Saturn, Uranus, and Pluto are doing. Astrologers, of course, do use many more tools than you've seen here today, and we do use tools that certainly give us greater confidence in pinning things down. But it really strikes me that this is one of the tragedies with the kind of expulsion of astrology from our culture in the really mostly in the 18th century and there onwards. Sure, astrology might not have fitted with the evolving scientific worldview, but the solution is not to throw it out completely. There's no doubt, as you can see from what you've seen here today, that astrology can contribute an enormous amount in understanding how time functions from the human experience and how change functions from the human experience. Imagine if it hadn't been thrown out 400 years ago. Imagine if we developed our research and developed our research tools. The current empirical model of research tools is very limited in its ability to study astrology anyway. But if we'd been less narrow-minded and we developed our tools and allowed the astrology to develop, perhaps we'd be looking at maps and charts that really pinpointed much more clearly. But as you've seen today, we can go a long way in understanding what's going on. We can go a long way in making predictions. As you've seen, it looks likely that until the very late months of this year, Europe remains vulnerable, especially France, United Kingdom, and the western side of Europe. The Middle East becomes increasingly a hotbed as the year goes on, and we are likely to see more attacks, more bombings, or whatever they may be in those places I've indicated as we go. So just imagine if we'd really allowed our astrology to develop, how much better we could be at knowing ahead of time. If we just opened our minds, we could be saving lives. Still time for one of your questions. Remember, you can send me your personal questions about anything that's happening in your life, and I'll give you a quick answer over here. And I have here a message from Sipho, you know who you are, who says that your business is going well, his business is going well, and money is not fantastic, but it doesn't look like it's a critical issue. And you've been offered an opportunity to expand by investing in another business at this time, and you want to know whether that's really worth it at this time. Well, Sipho, thanks for your question firstly, and thanks for watching. I do appreciate that. And I do want to say that I agree that your business looks intact at the moment and finances don't look like the major issue, but I do want to say don't mess with it right now. In fact, when I look at investment itself for your chart, this is just not the time to do it. Don't lose heart. There's plenty of space for your business to expand. It's really just a question of timing. If you can hang in until either the very end of this year or preferably next year, to use your money to invest in growing the business, that's going to be your perfect timing. Right now, it's kind of like, don't mess with it. You're going well. It's busy growing, and this investment right now is just not exactly the right time. Hope that's not a disappointment, but it can be exciting for next year and will help your business grow in the future. So good luck with that, and thanks again for your question. Remember, send your questions to me at this email address over here, and visit my website where you can also post your questions to me from there, or questions that aren't even personal that you might have about cosmology, politics, the world, or anything else that you've heard me talk about on this show, and perhaps even things that you haven't yet heard me talk about. Give it a try. And of course, join me back here next week at noon on YouTube, when back with your questions about the world and more Rod TV. Thanks for watching. See you then.